Ed Sullivan revealed the truth about the Beatles, and it's shocking. On February 9, 1964, Ed Sullivan introduced America to four young men from Liverpool who would change music forever. With a simple, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles," he ushered in a cultural phenomenon that would define a generation. A record-breaking 73 million viewers tuned in that night, approximately 40% of the American population, to witness the birth of Beatlemania. But while audiences saw only the perfect harmony of four mop-topped musicians charming the nation, Ed Sullivan witnessed something entirely different backstage. Away from the cameras, America's most discerning cultural gatekeeper observed tensions, conflicts, and personality clashes that would eventually tear apart the greatest band in music history. Sullivan had an uncanny ability to spot both talent and trouble, revealed a former production assistant who worked on those historic Beatles appearances. He could tell within minutes of meeting performers whether they had staying power. With the Beatles, he immediately recognized their extraordinary musical gifts, but he also saw warning signs that no one else noticed. In private conversations with close associates and in personal notes discovered years after his death, Sullivan made startling predictions about the Beatles' future that would prove remarkably accurate. These weren't just vague hunches, but specific observations about the interpersonal dynamics that would eventually destroy the band at the height of their creative powers. Tonight, we reveal the shocking insights Sullivan privately shared about the Beatles. Observations made when the rest of the world saw only perfect harmony, but which anticipated with eerie precision the conflicts that would ultimately end the most influential musical partnership of the 20th century. While America was falling in love with the Beatles as a unified force, Sullivan was noticing something troubling backstage. "I saw four individuals," he told his producer, "not a band. The cracks were already forming, long before the world would see them." Backstage, the cracks begin. The image America embraced on that February night in 1964 was one of perfect unity. Four young men with identical haircuts, matching suits, and synchronized bows who seemed to share one mind and one heart. The screaming fans, the witty press conferences, and the infectious performances created an illusion of harmony that defined Beatlemania. Backstage, however, Sullivan observed a very different dynamic playing out away from public view. Subtle tensions and personality differences that would eventually grow into unbridgeable divides. "They weren't what people thought they were," Sullivan reportedly confided to his producer after their first appearance. "This isn't just a band. It's four very different people barely held together by success. The cracks are already there if you know where to look." According to staff who worked those historic shows, Sullivan quickly identified the distinct personalities behind the unified Beatle image. He noticed John Lennon's biting sarcasm and intellectual restlessness, Paul McCartney's perfectionism and eagerness to please, George Harrison's quiet resentment at being sidelined, and Ringo Starr's good-natured attempts to maintain peace. "Too many egos. Too much friction. It won't last," Sullivan allegedly told his booker after the third Beatles appearance. This assessment came at a time when most industry experts were predicting decades of Beatles dominance, making Sullivan's foresight all the more remarkable. What Sullivan reportedly found most revealing was how the band members interacted, or didn't interact, when cameras weren't rolling. While they maintained a united front in public, backstage they often separated into different areas, with John and Paul discussing musical matters, while George and Ringo were left out of key conversations. Sullivan noticed immediately that they functioned as separate units rather than a cohesive whole, explained a production assistant. He'd seen countless performing groups come through his show, and he recognized the signs of a fragile alliance rather than a genuine brotherhood. This observation proved remarkably prescient. While the Beatles would create their most groundbreaking music in the years ahead, the personal bonds between them were already beginning to fray, exactly as Sullivan had sensed during those early American appearances. The tensions were particularly evident in how the band members responded to their explosive success. According to Sullivan's private notes, John seemed simultaneously drawn to and repelled by fame, using sarcasm as a shield against the mounting pressure. Paul embraced the spotlight most naturally, taking control of interviews and public appearances in ways that sometimes visibly irritated his bandmates. George withdrew further into himself with each appearance, his discomfort with Beatlemania increasingly apparent. Ringo, while maintaining his cheerful public persona, showed signs of the insecurity that comes from constant comparisons to his bandmates. Sullivan saw the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Beatles, explained a television historian who studied Sullivan's notes. They were marketed as 4 equal parts of a whole, but the reality he observed backstage was a hierarchy, clearly defined roles, and growing resentments. This disparity between image and reality is often what destroys groups, and Sullivan recognized it immediately. What made Sullivan's observations particularly significant was his unique position as both industry insider and objective observer. Unlike the reporters who got carefully managed access or the fans who saw only the public performance, Sullivan witnessed the Beatles in unguarded moments, when the pressures of their extraordinary success revealed the true dynamics within the group. He described watching them during rehearsals when they thought no one important was paying attention, said a stage manager who worked the show. The way John would roll his eyes at Paul's suggestions, the way George would make a musical point that the others would ignore, the way Ringo would try to lighten tense moments with a joke that sometimes fell flat. Sullivan saw all this and recognized the warning signs of a partnership under enormous strain. The argument Sullivan overheard between Lennon and McCartney would become the blueprint for their eventual split. What he heard backstage in 1965 foreshadowed exactly how the greatest songwriting partnership in history would eventually implode.
These youngsters from Liverpool, England, and their conduct over here not only as fine professional singers, but as a group of fine youngsters.
The private argument Sullivan overheard. During the Beatles' August 1965 appearance on his show, Sullivan accidentally witnessed an exchange between Lennon and McCartney that he would later describe as the moment I knew for certain they wouldn't last. This private argument, overheard when Sullivan unexpectedly returned to his office where the band was waiting, revealed the fundamental tension that would eventually tear the Beatles apart. Paul, to John, "If you want to be the star, just say it," recalled a Sullivan staff member who was present. John shot back, "You're just jealous I don't have to try." The tension in the room was unbearable. Sullivan quietly closed the door and left, but later told me, "This isn't a band, it's a pressure cooker waiting to explode." What made this exchange particularly revealing wasn't just the content, but how it exposed the fundamental philosophical divide between Lennon and McCartney. Paul's dedication to craft and perfection versus John's belief in raw authenticity and artistic intuition. This tension would eventually evolve from creative spark to irreconcilable difference. Sullivan understood creative partnerships better than most, explained a longtime associate. He'd seen countless performing duos and groups come through his show over decades. He recognized when tension was productive versus when it became destructive. With John and Paul, he saw both the brilliant creative friction and the seeds of eventual collapse. According to Sullivan's private notes, he was struck by how the Beatles' interpersonal dynamic had shifted since their first appearance just 18 months earlier. The playful camaraderie had been replaced by thinly veiled competition, particularly between the two principal songwriters. Harrison's increasing frustration at having his contributions marginalized was also becoming evident. "I've never seen success change people so quickly," Sullivan reportedly commented to his producer after that 1965 appearance. "They're moving in different directions already, and they don't even realize it yet." This assessment came during a period when the Beatles' public image remained one of unified brotherhood, making Sullivan's insights particularly remarkable. He recognized the warning signs of the band's eventual disintegration at a time when they were still ascending toward their creative peak. What Sullivan found most troubling about the argument wasn't just the obvious tension between Lennon and McCartney, but how it revealed the deeper fault lines within the group's dynamic. The exchange highlighted not merely a disagreement but fundamentally different approaches to art, fame, and creative expression that would eventually make continued collaboration impossible. The argument Sullivan overheard wasn't just about ego, noted a Beatles historian. It was about artistic philosophy. Paul believed in craftsmanship, accessibility, and perfection. John increasingly valued authenticity, experimentation, and emotional rawness. These approaches complemented each other brilliantly in their songwriting for years, but Sullivan recognized they would eventually become incompatible as each man's vision became more distinct. The incident also revealed McCartney's growing role as the band's de facto leader, a position that created both practical benefits and interpersonal tensions. Sullivan observed how Paul's natural organizational tendencies were keeping the band functioning professionally while simultaneously breeding resentment from his bandmates, particularly John and George, who chafed under what they perceived as Paul's controlling nature. Sullivan saw the impossible situation developing, explained his former assistant. The Beatles needed Paul's direction to maintain their professional momentum, but that same direction was creating friction that would eventually tear them apart. He described it as watching a car that needs its engine to run, but the engine is slowly cracking the frame. This observation proved remarkably accurate. In the years that followed, McCartney's leadership would become increasingly necessary as the band navigated their transition from touring act to studio innovators, while simultaneously creating deeper divisions that would culminate in the acrimonious business and creative disputes that ended the group. Yoko Ono has carried the blame for the Beatles' breakup for decades, but Sullivan saw through that myth immediately. She didn't cause the split, he told friends. She just gave John permission to do what he already wanted to do.
If I feel like performing, I'll perform, yeah. I mean, would you call Give Peace a Chance a solo performance? Maybe it is, but...
Yoko didn't break them, she just arrived late. When Yoko Ono entered John Lennon's life in 1966, she would eventually become the most convenient scapegoat for the Beatles' breakup. The narrative of Yoko as the band wrecker became so entrenched in popular culture that it persists even today. But according to associates, Sullivan rejected this simplistic explanation based on what he had observed years earlier. They were already falling apart, Sullivan reportedly told a friend after the band's dissolution became public in 1970. That Japanese artist didn't break up the Beatles. She just walked through a door that was already wide open. Sullivan's assessment came from watching the band's dynamic deteriorate across their multiple appearances on his show. By the mid-1960s, Sullivan had noted several troubling changes that predated Yoko's arrival. Less natural chemistry between the members, separate entourages and management priorities, and perhaps most tellingly, the complete absence of eye contact during performances, what Sullivan called four musicians playing together, but not with each other. Sullivan recognized that the real story was much more complex than the Yoko broke up the Beatles narrative, explained a television historian who studied Sullivan's career. He saw how the band members were growing in different directions artistically, developing separate identities and interests. Lennon's relationship with Ono was a symptom of the growing divide, not its cause. What Sullivan apparently found most significant was how quickly the band members had developed separate artistic visions. During their final appearance on his show, he noted that they no longer spoke about our music, but instead about individual contributions and separate tracks, an observation that proved remarkably prescient as the Beatles moved toward the more compartmentalized approach of their later albums. The band was splitting apart from within, Sullivan reportedly commented. Blaming an outside influence is easier than accepting that they simply outgrew each other. This nuanced understanding of the Beatles' disintegration demonstrated Sullivan's exceptional insight into creative partnerships. While the public and press sought a villain in the breakup narrative, Sullivan recognized the more complex and inevitable reality of four extraordinary talents who had begun moving in different directions. Sullivan's perspective on Yoko's role was particularly insightful given the sexism and xenophobia that often colored contemporary accounts. Rather than blaming the Asian woman who had infiltrated the beloved British group, as many critics and fans did, Sullivan focused on the underlying dynamics that had created the opening for her influence in the first place. Sullivan told me he thought Lennon was looking for an exit strategy long before he met Yoko, recalled a former producer. He needed someone who would give him permission to leave the band that had defined his life but was increasingly feeling like a constraint. Yoko didn't cause that feeling. She simply recognized it and offered him an alternative path. This assessment has been validated by subsequent accounts from Beatles insiders and by Lennon himself, who later acknowledged that his relationship with Yoko provided the courage and motivation to leave a situation he had already found creatively and personally stifling. Sullivan's ability to recognize this reality while others were crafting simpler narratives demonstrated his exceptional understanding of human behavior. What Sullivan understood was that successful creative partnerships often have natural lifespans, explained a music historian. The very differences that create productive tension initially can eventually make continued collaboration impossible. With the Beatles, those natural differences were accelerated and intensified by unprecedented success and attention. Sullivan saw Yoko not as the destroyer, but as the catalyst that simply accelerated an inevitable process. Indeed, Sullivan's private assessment acknowledged that each Beatle, not just Lennon, was seeking some form of individual expression by the late 1960s. He noted how George Harrison's songwriting had developed to a point where the traditional Lennon-McCartney dominance felt increasingly restrictive, and how even Ringo had begun developing interests outside the group. Yoko's arrival coincided with, rather than caused, this natural evolution toward individual expression. The Beatles' sudden refusal to perform live on Sullivan's show wasn't about schedules or artistic evolution. Sullivan knew the real reason. They simply couldn't stand being in the same room anymore. The world wouldn't learn the truth for years.
We opened them and we found out we weren't. We
all said that line.
I know, but this is at ITV. That was the other one.
Why the live shows suddenly stopped. Despite delivering record-breaking ratings with each appearance, the Beatles abruptly stopped performing live on The Ed Sullivan Show after 1966, instead providing pre-recorded promotional clips for their new singles. While the official explanation centered on the band's busy schedule and artistic evolution, Sullivan privately shared a much more troubling reason. They outgrew this, and each other, Sullivan allegedly told his producer when discussing the shift to video performances. This assessment came after Sullivan had attempted to book the band for another live appearance and encountered what he described as 4 different excuses from 4 different directions. According to Sullivan's staff members, what particularly struck the host was how the band's representatives negotiated these appearances. Rather than dealing with a unified management team as in earlier years, Sullivan's bookers found themselves navigating separate demands and priorities from each Beatles' individual management representatives, a clear sign of the fracturing unity within the group. The shift from live performances to promotional clips reflected a fundamental change in the band's dynamic. The energetic, unified group that had conquered America was being replaced by 4 separate artists with increasingly divergent visions, exactly as Sullivan had predicted years earlier. Sullivan saw the video clips as symbolic of the band's disintegration, explained a television historian. Instead of 4 young men feeding off each other's energy and the crowd's reaction, these promotional films often featured Beatles recording separately or in pairs, rarely showing all 4 members in the same frame. It visualized the very separation Sullivan had sensed backstage years earlier. What makes Sullivan's insight particularly remarkable is that it came during a period when the Beatles were creating their most innovative music. Albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band suggested a band at the height of their collaborative powers, but Sullivan correctly identified these achievements as masking the personal disconnection that was already well underway. The genius was still there, Sullivan reportedly commented after watching the Strawberry Fields Forever promotional clip. But the brotherhood is gone. They're creating separately now, even when they're supposedly working together. This observation anticipated by several years the recording process for The White Album, when the band members would often work in separate studios, bringing in the others only when necessary for specific contributions. Sullivan's early recognition of this shift demonstrated his exceptional understanding of group dynamics and creative partnerships. The contrast between the Beatles' earlier appearances and their late-period video contributions particularly concerned Sullivan, who believed that live performance revealed truths about performers that could be concealed in more controlled environments. He noted how the spontaneity and joy of their early Sullivan performances had been replaced by carefully constructed visual presentations that eliminated the need for real-time interaction. Sullivan told me the videos weren't just an artistic choice. They were a necessity, recalled a former production assistant. He believed the band had reached a point where they couldn't deliver a convincing performance of unity anymore. The films allowed them to maintain the Beatles myth while avoiding the reality of 4 people who could no longer comfortably share a stage. This assessment aligned with what we now know about the Beatles' eventual abandonment of live performance altogether in 1966. While the official reasons centered on the challenges of reproducing their increasingly complex studio creations and the overwhelming noise from screaming fans, the interpersonal tensions Sullivan had observed certainly contributed to their retreat from live appearances. What Sullivan recognized before others was that the Beatles were becoming more of a concept than an actual functioning band, explained a music historian. The promotional films allowed them to maintain the illusion of unity while actually working more and more independently. Sullivan saw this as both creatively freeing for them and ultimately fatal to their existence as a group. Indeed, Sullivan's assessment proved accurate. The Beatles' later albums, though containing some of their most innovative work, were increasingly the products of individual rather than collective creation. Abbey Road, despite its seamless sound, was largely assembled from separate contributions rather than created through the collaborative process of their earlier work. Sullivan described it as the most creative divorce in music history, noted a former colleague. They found a way to keep making extraordinary music together, even as they were growing further apart as people. But he knew it couldn't last. And he was right. While millions saw the cute one and the quiet one, Sullivan saw deeper character traits that would eventually tear the band apart. His private notes described the personality clash that would ultimately prove fatal to the greatest band in history.
Eric, here is the American public.
I'm John.
You're John.
It's only a joke.
Yes, well, John.
The personality clash. Four men who could no longer coexist. Beyond the specific incidents and observations, Sullivan developed a comprehensive understanding of the fundamental personality differences that made the Beatles' eventual breakup inevitable. His private assessments of each band member revealed insights that music historians would only fully appreciate decades later. According to those who saw Sullivan's personal notes, he identified distinct traits in each Beatle that initially created a perfect balance, but eventually became incompatible as each man matured and evolved. John Lennon, Sullivan observed, possessed revolutionary instincts constrained by commercial success. He noted Lennon's growing discomfort with the band's image and his increasing desire to use his platform for political and artistic statements that the Beatles format couldn't accommodate. Sullivan reportedly predicted that Lennon will eventually reject the entire Beatles construct as too limiting for his ambitions and too childish for his evolving worldview. Paul McCartney, in Sullivan's assessment, was a musical genius trapped by his own perfectionism. He recognized Paul's extraordinary talents were coupled with controlling tendencies that became more pronounced as the band's structure weakened. Sullivan reportedly commented that McCartney needs collaboration but can't help dominating it, a contradiction that will eventually drive others away despite his best intentions. George Harrison struck Sullivan as a spiritual seeker in a materialistic circus. He noted Harrison's growing interest in Eastern philosophy and musical traditions that were increasingly at odds with the commercial demands placed on the Beatles. Sullivan predicted that Harrison's patience has visible limits. His resentment at being considered secondary is building toward an inevitable breaking point. Ringo Starr was described by Sullivan as the group's emotional barometer. He observed how Starr's mood often reflected the overall health of the band's relationships, noting that when Ringo withdraws, it signals serious trouble beneath the surface. Sullivan was particularly struck by how Starr became increasingly quiet and detached during the band's later appearances. Sullivan understood that these weren't just four musicians who happened to play together, explained a television historian familiar with Sullivan's private writings. They were four distinct archetypes whose differences initially created perfect creative tension, but eventually became irreconcilable as each man's identity solidified. What Sullivan found particularly poignant was how fame had accelerated and intensified these natural personality differences. He noted that normal young adult development, finding one's identity, questioning authority, exploring new interests, was happening within the pressure cooker of unprecedented global attention, making natural growth and change nearly impossible to navigate harmoniously. Sullivan told me he thought the saddest part was that their success trapped them in relationships they were naturally outgrowing, recalled a former producer. Most young men their age could drift apart gradually as their interests changed. The Beatles had to maintain a public unity that was increasingly at odds with their private reality, creating unsustainable tension. This assessment has been validated by the band members themselves in subsequent years. In various interviews, all four Beatles have acknowledged how their individual growth and changing priorities created conflicts that eventually made continued collaboration impossible. Sullivan's ability to recognize these dynamics during their height of fame, when most observers saw only unprecedented success and harmony, demonstrated his exceptional insight into human behavior. The personality differences Sullivan identified were eventually expressed in their musical choices, noted a music historian. John's raw experimentation, Paul's melodic craftsmanship, George's spiritual exploration, and Ringo's unpretentious simplicity all became more pronounced as they moved towards solo careers. Sullivan saw these distinct identities forming when everyone else still viewed them as interchangeable parts of a unified whole. The Beatles publicly claimed they kept creating together because they loved the music. Sullivan knew the uncomfortable truth. They stayed together for the money, trapped by contracts they couldn't escape without destroying their financial empire.
Our road managers take the big luggage. So they turn the escalator off on them. They have to carry them up.
Golden handcuffs. Business pressures behind the breakup. While artistic differences and personality conflicts were driving the Beatles apart, Sullivan identified another crucial factor in their delayed breakup, one that rarely made it into the public narrative. According to associates, Sullivan recognized the complex business entanglements that kept the band functioning long after their personal relationships had deteriorated beyond repair. "They're bound by golden handcuffs," Sullivan reportedly commented to his producer after a tense negotiation for a Beatles appearance in 1968. "They'd split tomorrow if it didn't mean financial suicide." This astute observation referenced the complicated business structure the Beatles had created, including their Apple Corps company and various publishing agreements. These arrangements made a clean break nearly impossible without devastating financial consequences for all involved, creating a situation where they continued making music together despite growing personal animosity. "Sullivan understood the music business better than most television hosts," explained an industry executive who knew Sullivan. He recognized that the Beatles weren't just four musicians, but the core of a business empire employing hundreds of people and generating millions in revenue. Dismantling that structure wouldn't be simple, even if they all wanted out. According to Sullivan's private notes, he was particularly struck by the change in how Beatles management approached negotiations for appearances. What had once been straightforward discussions about performance details became complex legal conversations involving multiple lawyers representing different and sometimes conflicting interests within the Beatles organization. "The lawyers have replaced the music," Sullivan reportedly commented after one particularly difficult negotiation. "When it takes longer to agree on who stands where than it does to rehearse the songs, the end isn't far off." This observation proved remarkably accurate. The business complications Sullivan identified would eventually contribute significantly to the acrimony of the Beatles' breakup, with the band members locked in legal disputes for years after their creative partnership had ended. Sullivan recognized that money was both keeping them together and driving them apart, noted a former business associate. The financial entanglements made it difficult to break up cleanly, but disagreements about business decisions were creating additional tensions beyond their creative differences. This assessment has been validated by subsequent accounts from Beatles insiders and the band members themselves, who have acknowledged how business conflicts, particularly disagreements over management, contributed significantly to their breakup. The appointment of Alan Klein as business manager, supported by Lennon, Harrison, and Starr but opposed by McCartney, created divisions that accelerated the band's dissolution. Sullivan told me he thought it was tragic that a band formed out of genuine friendship and creative passion was ending over business disputes, recalled a former booker. He saw how the machinery of success they had built was now controlling them rather than serving them. This insight revealed Sullivan's understanding of how commercial success can fundamentally change artistic relationships. What begins as a creative partnership often evolves into a business entity with its own momentum and demands, creating pressures that can destroy the very relationships that formed its foundation. "The Beatles were trapped by their own success," Sullivan reportedly observed. "The bigger they became, the harder it was to walk away, even when staying together became personally unbearable." Sullivan claimed he saw the exact moment the Beatles died as a band, and it wasn't during the rooftop concert or any of the famous final sessions. It was a quiet moment backstage in 1967 that told him everything was already over.
Stage, the Beatles, bring them on!
The moment Sullivan knew it was truly over. Among Sullivan's most revealing observations was his identification of a specific moment when he became convinced the Beatles couldn't survive as a group, a quiet incident backstage that spoke volumes about how fundamentally their dynamic had changed. This moment, rarely discussed in Beatles histories, occurred before their performance of All You Need Is Love for the global television broadcast Our World in June 1967. Sullivan was invited to observe the rehearsals as a professional courtesy, explained a former NBC executive who was also present. What he witnessed was telling. The four Beatles arrived separately, rehearsed their parts with minimal interaction, and left without the kind of camaraderie that had defined their earlier years. But the moment that truly struck Sullivan came during a break. According to multiple accounts, Sullivan observed an interaction where Harrison made a suggestion about the arrangement, which McCartney dismissed without consideration. Lennon, rather than mediating as he might have in earlier years, remained absorbed in conversation with the production team, completely disconnected from his bandmates' discussion. Ringo observed the exchange with visible discomfort, but said nothing. After seeing that, Sullivan turned to me and said, "It's already over. They just haven't admitted it yet," recalled the executive. What struck him wasn't that they disagreed, creative partnerships always have disagreements, but the complete absence of mutual respect in how they communicated. They were no longer treating each other as equals, or even as friends. This observation came at a time when the Beatles were being hailed for the groundbreaking Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, and were still nearly 3 years away from their official breakup. Sullivan's ability to recognize the terminal state of their relationship long before it became public knowledge demonstrated his exceptional insight into group dynamics. "Sullivan told me he found it almost painful to watch," said a former associate. He described it as seeing 4 men who had shared one of history's most extraordinary journeys, now treating each other like distant acquaintances with competing agendas. The creative magic was still possible, but the human connection that had fueled it was gone. What made this assessment particularly remarkable was how it contradicted the public narrative of the Beatles at that time. The "All You Need Is Love" broadcast presented them as ambassadors of global unity and peace, an ironic contrast to the disconnection Sullivan observed behind the scenes. Sullivan had a particular sensitivity to the gap between public image and private reality, explained a television historian. He'd seen countless performers maintain the illusion of harmony while privately at odds. With the Beatles, he recognized that the disparity between their peaceful, unified public image and their fractured private reality had grown too large to be sustainable. This insight proved remarkably accurate. Though the Beatles would create more innovative music in the years ahead, the collaborative spirit that had defined their early work was indeed largely gone, replaced by the more compartmentalized approach that characterized their final albums. The magical mystery tour they invited fans to join was increasingly a manufactured illusion rather than a reflection of their actual relationship. What Sullivan understood was that great creative partnerships require more than talent. They require trust, mutual respect, and genuine connection, noted a music historian. He saw that these essential ingredients had eroded beyond recovery, even while the Beatles' technical abilities and creative ambitions were reaching new heights.